All right, ladies and gents, welcome back. So we're going to return to this idea of macroevolution and sort of leave genetic evolution behind for a little while. So if we go back to Darwin studying things like the finches in the Galapagos, he's looking at how there's this potential for an original ancestral finch species to get to these Galapagos Islands and then ultimately give rise to all of these different new species on these different islands based on the food sources and the beak shapes that he was seeing. So, what he's really interested in discussing is this idea of speciation. How do I go from this existing species and branch out? How do I get more species from that original population? And the idea really is an interesting one. But before we can jump into exactly what kind of mechanisms could bring about speciation, we need to have a definition for what a species is. And this is actually considerably more complicated the more you delve into it. When we define what a species is, the most common definition is utilizing this idea of this biological species concept, where I'm looking at a species as a population or a group of populations. So if I take members of those populations, mate them together, they're capable of producing offspring, but it's not just about producing offspring, it's also about producing fertile offspring, so that those offspring can then produce their own offspring if they were to mate together, and so on and so forth. So where does this get a little messy? Well, it works great as a definition for species who sexually reproduce. The cats in the picture, humans, most organisms that kids think about are sexually reproducing organisms. And so this works. The only problem is when we start getting into things like, well, how do we define a species if all I have are fossils? I can't watch them mate. I don't know if they can produce fertile offspring. So the definition sort of falls apart there. Also doesn't work really well for organisms who asexually reproduce, things like yeast and bacteria. So definition's not perfect, but for our purposes, for right now, it's going to work to define how a species functions, what a species is. So we'll kind of stick to this definition for our purposes this year. Just know that it's not perfect. All right. So, how can I go through that process of speciation then? Well, oftentimes geographic isolation is the first step. So, remember we talked previously about that idea of gene flow, moving organisms from one population to another, and as a result, moving their genetic information, increasing the diversity, keeping that diversity fresh. Well, if I get a situation where geographic isolation shows up, that means I've cut off the gene flow. I've now taken some sort of barrier that these organisms can't get through, can't get over, can't get around, and so I'm going to divide an original population into two or more groups. Those physical barriers can be things like rivers, mountains, dried riverbeds, and a geographic isolation example is going to be different depending on the species that you talk about. So if I look at my cute little chipmunks here, I've got one population on one side of the Grand Canyon, another on the other side, and that Colorado River running through. These guys aren't going to be able to cross that river, and so this now has become a geographically isolated two populations, two subsets of that population. If the environments on either side of that barrier are different for long enough, they stay separated for long enough, it's potentially the start to a speciation process. Now, if I go and talk about a breed of bird, species of bird, this probably isn't going to be a geographically isolated situation for them because presumably they could fly across the Grand Canyon and it's not something that's going to keep them separated. So the gene flow keeps going. But this is one potential option. If that gene flow stays in place long enough and those species, those populations then become what we just discussed as reproductively isolated, this is when we talk about having two different species. So geographic isolation may start the speciation process, reproductive isolation is going to end it. This is now when I'm talking about two different species, at least if I'm using that biological species concept, because these guys can no longer successfully mate with one another. If I took an individual from this population, tried to mate it with an individual from over here, it wouldn't be successful. And that reproductive isolation can come in a couple of different forms. One potential idea is this idea of temporal isolation, where there's actual timing barriers to the reproduction between populations. And the easiest way to think about temporal isolation is in plants, flowering plants. Those flowers are reproductive organs of those plants. They need the pollen to get into the flower. That's how they end up making the fruits. The fruits ultimately are the offspring for the next generation. And so if I'm looking at two breeds of apples, okay, those apple trees can reproduce or produce flowers anywhere from about mid to end August all the way into later in the fall, like October. So if I'm a particular species of apple that breeds in August, then I'm really going to have a hard time getting my pollen to a flower that blooms in October. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's where the temporal isolation comes in. They're not flowering at the same time, so they can't get the pollen to each other at the same time, and as a result, can't produce offspring successfully with each other. Another idea is this idea of mechanical isolation. So something has happened in their physiological structure, their morphology, the way that their reproductive organs are structured. And as a result, they literally can't have the act of sex. It just doesn't work. The pieces don't fit together. And as a result, no sperm transfer. Sperm needs to meet egg in order to make the offspring. And there's no sperm meeting the egg. So they become mechanically isolated. The other idea here is gametic incompatibility. So gametes are sex cells. Gamete is a fancy word for an egg or a sperm. And if they're incompatible, that means that those cells don't work well together. So the sperm may be able to transfer, they may be able to have sex, but that sperm isn't capable of fertilizing the egg. And as a result, no fertilization, no offspring. We can also have behavioral isolation, and this is where sexual selection comes in. So rather than that reproductive isolation being a timing thing or the way physical parts fit together or way the cells interact with each other, we're now talking about actual choice. So sexual selection, if we look at this, a female's reproductive cost, the energy, the time, that it takes her to produce offspring for the next generation is considerably higher than it is for a male. She's the one who has to house the egg, whether it's internally or externally. She's usually the one who gives any sort of parental care if that species does that at all. And so as a result, it makes sense that she wants to choose a male partner who's going to give her offspring the genes that are best suited for success in the environment. So she's going to be choosy about the mates that she picks. So any of those traits that improve their mating success should increase in frequency over time. So when we look at sexual selection, it really can kind of come down to two pieces. It can be intrasexual selection, where the female really doesn't have the choice per se, but she's mating with a male who wins in some sort of competition. All right, somebody like our two rams there at the bottom. Whoever is the strongest, capable of knocking the other out, the guy who wins is the one who mates with the girl. The intrasexual selection is when the males have some sort of display of certain characteristics that are attractive to the females. The peacock, for example. Clearly that peacock coloration, those big bold feathers, the dances that they do for their females, sets them up to be more likely to be attacked by a predator. And yet, why have those colorations and those patterns continued to persist through evolutionary history? Because the girls like it. All right, and we think there might be some tie to actual physiological health when we look at that coloration pattern and things like these birds, and that's why the females are choosing them. Jury's still kind of out on that, but that's sort of the underlying hypothesis, at least. So if the female's going to spend all of this time, resources, energy, her own molecules making that offspring and then caring for it, clearly she wants to choose the male that's going to give her offspring the best chance possible, who's going to give the traits that are going to ensure that her offspring are the ones that continue to make it to the next generation. And so that's where that idea of sexual selection comes in.